Welcome to Lore Talks. I'm Elioaux.
And I'm Niniri Niri.
And today we are going to be talking about the early history of, well, if not Gridania, then the Black Shroud as a whole.
Right, exactly. Everything up to the founding of Gridania, just touching on the very first moments of Gridania's life.
Yes, and as with all the other things that we've touched on, it should be a fascinating dive as well.
Absolutely, Gridania is a really interesting topic. Just like the other city states, it's got its own moral complexities, and it's a really interesting culture. Based on sort of Druidism and Shintoism. Really fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time, and there was a recent discussion that's been happening with people in our community around the different complexities with the different city states, and both Gelmorra and Gridania have their own very fascinating legacies.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. It's a discussion worth having as a community, both for the channel and wider in the fan base.
So, hopping into it, why don't we talk about the sort of geographic location with the who, what, where's, and whys, starting with the what is the Black Shroud slash the Twelves Wood?
Right, so the Black Shroud is just this absolutely enormous forest in central Eorzean. It's best known for its really rich plant and animal life, and of course, the colossally powerful and very mysterious, slightly less mysterious now, elementals that seem to have ruled over it for as long as records can really be found.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found interesting is that post the Seventh Thermal Calamity, those elementals have been weakened. So even in modern times, the relationship between the woods, its peoples, and the elementals has become a constant note of fascinating history. And as we're going to dive in here, that has been true throughout its entire existence.
Oh yeah, definitely. They're as much a player in the political landscape of Eorzea as any nation.
There's also the location that is the hedge. Why don't we hit on that real quick?
So, from what I am able to surmise, it's not 100% laid out, but from what I'm able to surmise, the hedge is a series of protective trees called hedge trees, which are connected in this really potent etheric network as a barrier around the shroud. Now, I'm not 100% sure if this is like a soft barrier or a hard barrier. If it's like literally a force field, or if it keeps out certain malign etheric effects, it's hard to tell.
The fact that things like the Autumn War can happen and that there is regular interactions and trade between groups makes me think it's more of a soft barrier, but that's a supposition.
I think that's a fair supposition, though.
So, who occupies the Black Shroud?
So, at the time that we're talking about, so sort of speaking broadly, so not specifically about Gelmorra, Amdapor itself, was inhabited mostly by Midlanders. But then moving on from this, in the wake of sort of the fall of Amdapor and the beginning of the Astral Era that we're discussing, the Shroud seems to have been inhabited mostly by Ixal, who had the permission of the Elementals in this period.
Yeah, and as we go along, we'll find the Hure and Elezen who come to occupy it and the contentions there within.
Certainly, yeah.
So, why is the Black Shroud the way it is? An enormous forest, as verdant as it is.
So it's a difficult one to answer, but as with all things in this universe, it comes back to etheric density. We have to assume that the shroud is very, very rich in aether, which sort of might be signified by the elementals being there as well. They are elementals and thus are beings of pure aether. And I assume they also have a role to play in just how verdant it is. They're stopping poachers, they're stopping over deforestation, they're sort of promoting the greenery and the verdancy of the Black Shroud.
Foregoing some specific future knowledge we know from Endwalker, it was always a question of sort of the chicken of the egg. Do the elementals beget the forest or the forest beget the elementals?
Right, exactly.
So, why don't we talk about the primary civilization that exists during the first half of the sixth astral era then, and go through the who, what, where, and whens of Gelmorra?
Right, exactly.
So, who and what is Gelmorra?
So, Gelmorra was predominantly, if not solely, inhabited by Midlander Hyrs and Wildwood Elezen. Now, Wildwood isn't quite the right term here. They would have been closest to Wildwood of any of the species. They would have been somewhat like a mixture between the Coerthan Elezen and the Wildwood Elezen. One would have to assume.
Yes, and inexorably that ends up leading towards the Duskwite later on.
Exactly, yeah. So Gelmorra is a subterranean nation. So it's entirely built into this huge like network of tunnels and chambers beneath the Black Shroud. Some of them were natural, some of them were man-made. They were a monarchy. They had an established system of aristocratic houses, nobles, and that sort of thing. We don't know a huge amount about their sort of governing structure besides those sort of small nodes. So they had a monarchy, they had an aristocracy.
And I'm sure we'll get into this later, but to get on to the where, we can see remnants of their civilization in locations like Tamtara Deepcroft and some of the other tunnels and places around the Black Shroud.
Right. We do know where the center of their city, where their capital, for want of a better word, is, but we can get into that a bit later.
Sounds good. So then, when did Gelmorra exist and why did it fall?
So, Gelmorra's founding began in the 7th and 8th centuries of the 6th Astral Era. It fell in the 11th century, and fall is a strong term, but it was founded almost exclusively because of the influence of the elementals. Their extreme violence, and it was extreme, against the Elezen and Hyr that had migrated into the Twelves would force them to make peace with each other and move underground. Well, it was the other way around. They moved underground and then gradually made peace with each other. Gelmorra's journey really begins in 660 of the Sixth Astral Era with the arrival of the Elezen in the Shroud. They were driven there by Hyr because all throughout history, the Hyr have migrated en masse into Eorzea, well, into Eldonard, and destabilized it.
If nothing, I feel like the thing that most defines the Hyr as a race is their migratory disposition. While other races we've seen do such, between the Al-Ra, the Rogadin, like throughout history, they seem the most predisposed to do that and end up just about everywhere.
They certainly do, yeah. And they continue to do so. In fact, they followed the Elezen into the Shroud, who they just chased there, about half a century later. And the Elementals do not take kindly to this. They did not consent to either of these groups joining the Black Shroud. And in 740, they are driven below ground and forced to make peace down there, surviving sort of despite the influence of the Elementals. And there they found Gelmorra. Gelmorra later falls, but is more really dissolved willingly by most inhabitants. Not all, because the Duskwites stay down there, but willingly to go and live in peace with the elementals on the surface.
It's more of a transition, really, in a sense.
Very much so. Whereas Beladiah is schismed into two and then becomes Uldar and Sildi, Gelmorra flows pretty smoothly into Gridania.
So while we're sitting in the 8th century, having gotten to Gelmorra, why don't we hop back for a second to the 1st century, during the time post the Sixth Umbral Calamity and the Worldwide Flood? What happened to Amdapor, which existed in and around the Shroud at that time?
Right. So Amdapor is centered on the South Shroud at this period, which was not a part of the Black Shroud in the sense that it wasn't part of the main forest ruled by the elementals. And Amdapor is one of these city-states, like all of the city-states of Eldonard, that falls to the floodwaters of the Calamity. It's the last one to do so. And when it does fall, the elementals expand the Black Shroud to cover South Shroud, and they seal the greatest holdings of Amdapor in these prisons of wood and magic to keep the white magics of both Amdapor and Mac and the Void Scent hidden inside. The survivors of Amdapor, meanwhile, have already left by this point. That they've fled before the floodwaters arrived, mostly, and they find themselves in Girabania, where they go on to sort of integrate with the Huron tribes that become Alamigo.
And then we end up flowing right back into the first couple of centuries, and that also ends up leading to the Red Mage, to Belladia, and all sorts of things. It's all interconnected.
Yeah, it's hugely interconnected. Yeah, definitely.
So we often hear in the game the term Twelveswood and the Black Shroud, and they're used almost interchangeably. But what is the defining difference between those terms?
So they are synonymous. They mean the same thing. The Twelves Wood is the Gridanian name for the woods, and the outsiders refer to it as the Black Shroud. So the Black Shroud is an international term, whereas the Twelves Wood is a local term. Probably a show of religious devotion.
When you think about how the Sanctum of 12 is hidden within its bounds and the way in which they worship Nafka, it's not surprising.
Right, exactly. And the Gridanians actually believe that the elementals of the Twelves Wood are shards of Nothuca.
Makes you wonder if they'll pop back up in Mists of the Realm.
It certainly does.
So we know that also predominantly beyond the Hure, right? There is the Elezen population. What is exactly up with the Duskrite and Wildwood Elezen and their relationship with the Shroud?
Right. So the Elezen, like we said, are when they move into Gelmorra, they seem to be sort of a people that we're not entirely acquainted with at this point, but that they were probably closer to the Wildwood than anything else. Or, like I said, a fusion between the Wildwood and the Coerthan Elezen. Now, they have an extremely tense relationship at first when they move into the Shroud with the Hyr, because of course the Hyr are the ones that have driven the Elezen away from their home, and some of them into Querthus, some of them into the Twelves Wood. However, once they get down into Gelmorra, the Hyr and the Elezen show a pretty decent amount of racial harmony. And in fact, there is element to suggest that the Dusk Rites, and they will deny this apparently in law, but they are a fusion both genetically, for want of a better word, because we don't really know if genetics exists in this universe, and culturally of Huron and Elezen sort of culture. For example, Duskrite names are very heavily influenced by Huron culture. You can sort of see this fusion. And also, some hypothesize, like I said, a biological Huron ancestry. This is detailed in the Duskwhite page on Encyclopedia Eorzean 1. Unfortunately, when the Duskwights are left underground of their own free will, they want to remain in Gridania. There are significant tensions because without the structure of the Gelmorran state, they really struggle to maintain themselves, economically, financially, and a lot of them turn to brigandry. Meanwhile, the new Gridanian nation is a little bit oppressive of them at the same time. This results in very tense relationships between the Gridanians and this new subspecies, and also they continue to practice ancient Gelmorran magics that are supposed to keep elementals out of an area, sort of runic magics and their pomanders, which are able to ward away elementals and their power, which of course is inflammatory to Gridania.
Yes, and if you've done Palace of the Dead, you will be intimately familiar with such pomanders.
Exactly.
So the other major populace of the Shroud, both at this time and, well, technically not in and of it later on, is the Ixali. And what is their whole relationship with the Shroud, both previously, during this period, and into the future?
Right, so the Ixal have lived in the Shroud for a very long time. They lived in there even in the very early fifth Astral Era when Amdapor arrived. When the Hyr that would found Amdapor arrived there, they were still living in there at that point, with the blessing of the elementals. Of course, they can't have been living in there for much longer than that because they were created in the third Astral Era, but still by 1020 of the sixth Astra, their population had grown much too large for the forest to sustain, and they seem to have over sort of deforested the shroud by cutting down too many trees, clearing too much land to support themselves. The elementals very harshly react, as they do. They're a pretty cruel landlord and evict them en masse, where they have to migrate to Zelphatol, which is up in the mountains of Abalathia's Spine, and it's really barren and cold. And even today, they're barely surviving up in Zelphatol. They're having to steal wood from the Shroud, they're having to poach animals from the Shroud and from Coerthus. It's a really brutal life for them up there.
Yeah, and just for context, when you referred to earlier them being created, it is revealed in the etherochemical factory Hard that the Ixali were not them initially, but descendants of chimeric creations by Alag.
Yes, that's right. They are descended from the Ixalian.
Despite the fact that it's such a hard climate to survive in up in Zelphatol, they still managed to be the first to invent flight via the ceruleum gases that they discovered there, which is rather interesting.
Yeah, they certainly do. And that is born in part of a, the Eorzean powers. I would have assumed would have downplayed the ingenious nature of many of these tribes. A lot of them are seen when we first arrive as these alien, aggressive cultures, but they're not. Of course, they're largely the natives of the land that these states live on. They have a fixation on flight because they used to be able to fly, and their homeland is Azazla, which is of course up in the sky. So they have this fixation on achieving flight. So this is sort of what drives them to create these first airships. They're called dirigibles. They're not. It's kind of more of a hot air balloon than it is a an airship, but yeah,
Their initial versions did not have much in the way of controlled flight.
right, exactly.
So, speaking of the Ixali and the elementals, why don't we go a little bit deeper into what the elementals are precisely? The whole idea of them, the representations in the Twelves Wood, and ideas like the Green Wrath.
Right. Okay. So there are several forms of elementals on Etheris. It is a term, sort of a taxonomic term, a category of beings that are composed of pure ether, like sprites and the eggies that summoners can create, as well as the specific form of elementals that perhaps are better referred to as Twelveswood elementals. Now, these creatures are vastly powerful, like I said, and are worshipped as aspects of Nothica by the Gridanians, though they are presumably not. When an individual starts to profane the Black Shroud by abusing its resources or endangering it, they start to accrue something called wood sin. If they accrue enough wood sin, they will eventually. This will result in green wrath. The green wrath is typically an assault on their person by treants and beasts and even the elementals themselves. It can be extremely dangerous, and the Gridanians, at least, are very worried about it snowballing into like something very, very fatal.
Yeah, and we see it depicted a couple times loosely in game via the early Gridanian starting quests when you attempt to grab the sword and first meet Papalinimo and Yida. I believe also the White Mage quests. You have to calm the Guardian Tree Evershade down, or
That's right.
yes, okay.
You also see it quite a lot in 1.0.
Yes, so yeah, it was almost more, especially ideas like the Green Wrath and Green Sin played a much bigger role in 1.0 contrasted to what we see in A Realm Reborn on.
Yeah, they absolutely did. Which is sort of where I think a lot of the relics of what the elementals claim that they're able to do come from, where perhaps they're not actually able to. Such as in older lore, they claim to be able to bring about calamities. They claim to be the one who brought about the Great Flood, which of course
We
is
know is not
not
the
true.
case.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the game hasn't mentioned that in some time, so maybe they're trying to sort of quieten that down a bit.
Yeah, it's always been that question I think me and both of you have contended with is at least ever since I've known you, which is was that stuff recontextualized as the elementals bullshitting, or was it always intended to be that it's not entirely clear because of how much shifted from 1.0 to 2.0?
Right, exactly. The shift is huge.
So then the two main questions I have coming from that are why are the elementals only in the shroud? And I guess more broadly going off of the idea of Green Wrath and Woodson, why is it that they reject the outsiders and why is there such a xenophobia when it comes to the peoples of more specifically Gridania once they have a relationship with the elementals?
So, with respects to why they're only in the shroud, it's not 100% easy to say. I suspect that they have settled there because it's just so verdant. Even devoid of elementals, the shroud is hugely densely populated by animals and very forested. It also has the sylphs, and also, of course, the sylphs live in there. Now, the sylphs are innately nature-respecting spellcasters, and they sort of feed back into this etheric richness. I think it just seemed a very convenient place to the elementals. Now, with the information that we get from Endwalker, which mute if you want to for the next however long.
I will put a warning in, I will put a timestamp that you can click to. We will give you 5 seconds. Five, four, three, two, one.
Right. So when we go to Elpis, we see a number of little tiny elementals floating around a man. Now, to my immense frustration, the man doesn't have dialogue. He doesn't tell you what these things are.
That's all too common in Elpis. Like the amount of times where
Yes.
they like give you a little bit of something but nothing more is like the what is it called? The 12's place. The 12 Wonders.
The 12 Wonders, yes.
What's up with the 12 Wonders? Why is it called that? Is there supposed to be something we're taking away from that? Who knows?
I personally suspect that these are an attempt by the ancients to create essentially a climate control mechanism, and that's what the elementals are. And they've settled in the Twelveswood because it's like a perfect climate for them to control, and they have indeed been controlling it for many centuries now.
I'd say, I mean, they would be effectively doing what they do. And the fact that they're found within a relatively forested area upon Elpis helps even fuel that further.
Yeah, definitely. Now, as for their xenophobia, for want of a better term, the elementals have always been protective of the shroud. This is not new to Gelmorra and to Gridania. They denied the Amdapori entry. Now, the Amdapori accepted this, and they ended up sort of developing a working relationship with the elementals, but were never permitted to live in the shroud. They ejected the Ixal, and then they tried to deny entry to the Elezen and the Hyr. This has resulted in some problems for Gridania. The Gridanians are very proud of them being permitted to live in there and are absolutely terrified of losing it. And, just being killed wholesale by the elementals. So they've become very stubborn, very traditionalist, very insular. And this was probably only worsened by events like the Autumn War with Alamigo, when they tried to invade Gridania. So Gridania has become, in part because of the elementals, this very xenophobic, very insular place.
And that has proved rather difficult for them in the modern era. I think it's interesting in contrast to the legacies of Limsa Lominsa and Ul'dah, and the difficulties they deal with as civilizations, I think are more easy to see on the surface level of the history of piracy and marauding for Limsa and the focus on wealth accruement and violence of Ul'dah are the disparity of wealth there are very easy to see, whereas sometimes it's easy to miss the sheer amount of xenophobic rhetoric and culture that exists in Gridania and the struggle it has to deal with because of that.
Right, exactly. And the authoritarian government that Gridania has, I mean, look at Totorak, right? So there's a
Yeah.
horrible prison, the worst imaginable prison. And vast corporal punishment going on in there back when it was still open. And the people that were in prison there weren't mass murderers; they were poachers. They were people who like arsonists. If you do any arson, you go in there. If you poach, you go in there. It's they are so strict, and with reason. I will give them on any environmental crime.
It's simultaneously understandable, but also more of a even more condemning the fact that have a complete control. The government has complete and utter control because they have an existential fear, but at the same time, that existential fear is unending.
Right? Yeah, exactly. It is understandable, but not ideal.
And the fact that more often than not, the punishment for any breaking of the laws is quite often just death outright is, you know,
Yes,
maybe worrying to some degree.
a little bit, I would say.
So we haven't spoken about one other people that doesn't live singularly in the Shroud, but is often known to be found there, and that's the Moogles.
Right, exactly. So the Mughals, as I'm sure all of you know, are this sort of very diminutive and vastly magically talented race. They, by and large, keep to themselves. They live in tribal societies headed by a chieftain, but with pretty much no actual government, and they are very reclusive. Now, their existence in sort of in the vicinity of Gridania, has started to open them up. They are working as a postal service for kan-e-senna, for example. Or well, at her behest, she doesn't run it. They're not native to the Shroud, though. Like you said, they hail from the Sea of Clouds. The Mughals of the Sea of Clouds are actually the most ancient still living society that we know of. They date back to the first Umbral Calamity, it seems.
After the Sixth Umber Calamity, we were able to figure out that the first must have been one of wind because of a process of elimination. However, the other reason we know that the first Umber Calamity was one of wind is because there are records, or at least spoken stories by the Moogle, of tempestuous winds of that period, which is very interesting.
Yeah, fascinating, definitely.
So why don't we head back on in to Gelmorra a little bit before continuing on in the timeline? Why don't we talk about some of the relics of their world that still linger on into the later half of the sixth and the seventh astral era, uh, Temtera, Deepcroft, and Toto Rock, and some of the other locales.
Right. Okay. So let's start with Isam and the Palace of the Dead. So we don't know a huge amount about what the palace itself was, but it is inside the area of Isam, which was the major residential district for the city of Gelmorra. It's not known what purpose the palace itself had. That's probably not even its true name. It could be, but it might not be. It could have been a prison, like the there are some sources that describe it as a dungeon in lore, not just a dungeon in gaming terms. And there is also some suggestion, if that is its name, its true name, that it was a funerary complex, because funerary rites and sort of mortuary rites are hugely important in Gelmorran culture, from what we can see. We see this in Palace of the Dead. We see this in Tamtara as well.
Much like the other civilizations that we've talked about that no longer exist, they are damn near omnipresent in the locales they were in, and you have almost certainly experienced them in a number of ways, even if you haven't been highly aware that that was what you were dealing with, which is one of the reasons I love Final Fantasy XIV. I know you do as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. So Tamtara, as I'm sure you were all painfully acquainted with from your time in Roulette, is a one of the countless Gelmorran ruins that are still accessible from the surface. It was, in fact, not solely Gelmorran, but was, and pseudo still was until the Calamity, used by Gridania. It was used as a crypt for Gelmorra and Gridania's dead, mostly the kings and the nobles and the priests of these states. Of course, in the wake of the fall of Dalamud, it was taken over by the Lambs of Dalamud, a dangerous cult, but before that, it was still in use by Gridania.
Yeah, and it housed the grave of great rulers of Gelmorra, like King Galvanth, which ends up
Yes,
coming back up in the Todorok dungeon itself.
it certainly does, and I'm sure that we'll discuss Galvanth at some point as well. Totorak. Now, so here's my little disclaimer. I don't think Totorak is Gelmorran. At face value, it seems Gelmorran. It's never mentioned as being Gelmorran though, and it is named specifically for Padjal stories, which did not exist in the time of Gelmorra. I suspect that it is, in fact, a successor, a Gridanian successor to the Spirit Hold, which was a Gelmorran prison. It may have been built by Gelmorra, but in the iteration we know it as now, I think is almost entirely Gridanian.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the fact that it has a Pagel name alone says, at the very least, it has been repurposed by Gridania. To what extent could be quibbled over, perhaps, but I think there's no question that the structure, to my mind, is likely built by them because of the use of stone and how rare that is for Gridania, even in its early period that we know of. But I am with you 100%.
Yeah, that's certainly true. So, as we mentioned, Totorak is a prison for the most heinous crimes of Gridania. Now, that was, like I said, poachers and arsonists, not what we would consider the most heinous crimes imaginable. It's not the only prison of the area, though. The Spirit Hold was a Gelmorran prison, first ran by a warden named Warren. That name speaks to me here, but we don't have any confirmation of that. We don't know much about it, but by the time of Gridania, it was considered either useless enough or dangerous enough that they wanted to magically consign it to be destroyed by the elementals. They conduct this ritual to try and give it back to the elementals so they can destroy it with overgrowth and all of that sort of stuff.
So there's also the Gelmorran ruins in the North Shroud. What's up with those?
So that's interesting, right? They have this super generic name, so you might not look at them twice. You might think, "Oh, it's just some section of Gelmorra." Actually, the game and Encyclopedia Eorzean tell us that the Gelmorran ruins are the capital of Gelmorra. They tell us that they are directly on top of what the true capital, the true heart of Gelmorra was.
It's almost crazy that such an important place is almost treated so backhandedly. At the same time, I can understand one with the North Shroud being as wrecked as it was from Dalamud, but on top of that, that would have been a lot of content and or locale to create. So I can kind of respect not having wanting to recreate that for A Realm Reborn.
Oh, definitely. It's prime location for future dungeons or whatever else they want to do there, though.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if we'll ever really revisit the North Shroud. There's still things within. I mean, you have Ogomoro, right, in Vilbrand. You have the southern, what lies beyond the Sigoli Desert to the south in Thanalan, to
Hmm.
say of nothing of other regions as well. And then you have places like the Northern Shroud and parts of the Eastern Shroud with Gridania, or with the Black Shroud as a whole. There's stuff on Eorzea, itself that we still have yet to explore, let alone the larger world.
Oh yeah, there's huge amounts of stuff in Eorzean, and there's much huger amounts of stuff in Aldenard, so like the far northern areas and the far south. And I would maybe contextualize Pagothan and the areas north of that as outside of Eorzea as well.
Yeah, it depends on how we want to look at that. Yeah. Yeah, but then to say, to speak of Ilsabard and Othard, and then to say nothing of Mericidia and the New World,
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've got unlimited content.
we've got another 10 years at minimum.
Yeah.
So, what exactly was the political system? I know we spoke a little bit on it with the monarchy that Gelmorra had, but why don't we go to delve a little bit deeper?
So, from what I can piece together, we have a monarchy, we have noble houses, of which we know a few names. You can find them all. In fact, Koji has put a list out there if you want to go ahead and look for that. But there is a powerful priesthood of Nothica, which seems to have had a focus on understanding life and death via the natural world, which we see in Tamtara by the green wood and the wormwood, and the other wood altars, which seem to sort of play out a metaphor for life through the perspective of the natural world, of a tree growing from a sapling into a full-grown tree into a dead tree full of worms. Also, at the core of Gelmorra's political system seems to have been uh, a harmony between Hyr and Elezen. I would suggest that perhaps the monarchy was Elezen because Galvanth sounds like a more Elezen name to me than Huron. Galvanth was a respected monarch of Gelmorra and a very talented lancer. He honed himself in battle against the Ixal. Now, this surprises me because Gelmorra was entirely or almost entirely subterranean, and the Ixal presumably lived above ground while they were in the Shroud because they had permission from the Elementals. So it speaks to me that the Ixal either must have raided down into the caves, or Gelmorra raided up onto the surface. That's the only way that I could see them conflicting.
The fact that we don't see a very specific farming of mushrooms or other life-sustaining things. There are some, but not a ton for Gelmorra, makes me think that there must have been some amount of foraging above ground.
I would assume so, but they did have the Muntais cellars, which was a huge
Yes.
agricultural complex, which I think is one of the few locations that we can sort of point to nowadays as a true dusk white, sort of center.
I would agree. I would also say the fact that the Duskwhites still are often poachers, to me, even in present day, doubles down on that there must be at least some amount of foraging for protein, or maybe it's for wood, or maybe, it could be for any number of things.
I would think, and I would also think that the fact that they had developed runes to keep the elementals out must have meant that the elementals weren't entirely happy, although they were no longer full on apocalypse mode. They weren't entirely happy with the Gamorans living under the shroud. I wonder if they tasked the Ixol to raid down into the caves as well.
Yeah, quite possible. One of the other things about Galvanth is you may be familiar with his name, whether you realize it or not, in that his corpse is defiled by the Lambs of Dalamud and a void scent placed in it. And that becomes Galvanth the Dominator, the final boss of the original Tamtara dungeon.
Right, and I can just comfort you all. He didn't look like a squid in real life. That was the void scent. Uh,
Worth
um,
noting, worth noting.
Yeah, I think it's valuable to note. Now, Galvanth, you also might be acquainted with because there is a spire, one of the sort of armed spires of Gridania, nowadays called Galvanth Spire. I would have to assume it's named that because the spires were built specifically to fight Ixal, and that's where Galvanth got his fame. It's just another sort of note of how beautiful the attention to detail in this game is, of its own world building.
Unceasingly. If you ever get a chance, and I've tried to share some in the Discord, definitely go check out every lore interview possible with people like Koji. Like, onto the very beginning of the creation of this game, they were thinking very carefully and very deeply about the world and the lore and the intentionality of things.
Definitely, yeah.
Speaking of combat, why don't we talk about the magic and arms and sort of fighting style of Gelmorra, because it ends up leading into the relationship that Gridania has with those same practices.
Right. So lance users seem to be important to Elezen culture sort of across the board. The Querthan, it seems to be pre-Huron migration. The Elezen in Querthas and the Elezen in Gelmorra both used it. They also, at least the ones in Gelmorra, used archery very heavily, and that's where the roots of Gridanian archery come from. Uh, it seems almost like they specialized in lance and bow, while the ones um in Coerthas specialized in lance and sort of different types of swords and stuff like that. But there were sword wielders in Gelmorra. We see their reanimated corpses in Tamtara. There are also thaumaturges in Tamtara. Now, I'm not 100% sure if they would have practiced thaumaturgy. It's possible. It's not too hard to discover thaumaturgy, or even just to have had it.
We've talked about this in the past, right? The idea that every class and job, I mean, jobs less so, jobs are more specific, but classes especially are more a collection of practices as we know them. And so a thaumaturge is not necessarily a thaumaturge, is not necessarily a thaumaturge. So the practices that they may have been partial to may not be identical to what exists currently for the Order of Nalthal, let's say. But at the same time, it is effectively what we would refer to and know as a thaumaturge.
Right, exactly. And we can point to who these Elezen were. I forgot to talk about this earlier, but if you'll indulge me,
Yeah,
the Elezen so we know where the Elezen lived, at least some of them, in the fifth Ashlara. So we have a very, very small mention of it, but we do have mention of it that the Elezen who would go into Found Querthus, which of course were a branch off of the same branch that went into the Twelves Wood, were a city state of their own, probably conquered by Mark Amdapor, I would say, that worshipped Hydaelyn in central Eorzea. I would have to assume we're talking that sort of river basin that we never go to where the White Maiden flows between Avalatia Spine and the Black Shroud, and sort of just above Mordona. I would have to assume that's where they're talking about. So I wonder if, because the fact that this civilization worshipped Hydaelyn, in Ishgard we see thaumaturges who are integrated into the Church of Hydaelyn. I wonder if maybe there's a route there. There's a theory, of course, but something to think about.
talking about the relationship of Elezens and people to their locales and gods, why don't we talk about Nafka and Gelmorra and their relationship with that specific deity of the 12? Because it's interesting to note their primary deity of the 12 was the same as Gridania's.
Right. So the Gelmorrans did worship Nafka indeed as their patron, and it seems almost as if those living in and around the Shroud invariably worship Nafka. Amdapor worship Nafka. Gelmorra, which has no cultural ties to Amdapor, worship Nafka. Gridania continued to worship Nafka. This is not like Mark, whose god we don't even know, and then Beladaya, who worshipped Azema, into Uldar, who worshipped Nalthal. It's not like Nim and then into Limsa, who worship, of course, Limlaen. So yeah, it seems as if the location sort of inherently draws people to worship Nilfgaard, which makes sense, right? It
Right.
is perhaps the most ideal location to worship her. It's the only location that we know of that hasn't changed deities, even though, like, for example, like Limsa Lominsa, you can't actually really draw a strong tie between the states of the Black Shroud and between the fifth and the sixth Ashalaras, just like you can't with Nim and with Limsa. It's a really interesting thing that they have continued to worship Nafka. I wonder if this is a result of living near nature spirits that are of a near deific power level. That would be what I would have to assume.
Assume, I mean, and like you say, being in and around the Shroud, I would also point to the other civilizations, right? Limlane makes sense as Limsa Liminsa is, praying to the navigator and sea voyages and journeying, whereas Nim, Oshan makes almost a little bit more sense as the wanderer and kind of a scholar and their relationship with mountains and the world. And then you look to Uldah's relationship with trade and being mercantile, and why, of course, it would go with Nalthal, maybe more than Azima. And so there are almost reasons to split up like the two of fire or the two of wind for those different locales. Whereas I can't think of a reason Amdapor, Gelmorra, or Gridania would want to worship Ulthik. Like,
Yeah,
like he's a second of Earth, but like representation of time. And there's not, despite his stone being by Amdapor Keep, there's not really a strong connection between him and any of those places. So with only one Earth aspected member of the 12 remaining, Nafka all the more makes the most sense as the matron.
yeah, hugely so.
So speaking of symbology related to Gridania, why don't we actually talk about the Gelmorran flag, because that ends up becoming very interesting and relevant.
Right, so you might have noticed, if you've ever seen the Gelmorran flag, that it looks a lot like the Gridanian flag, and you've probably seen it if you don't think you have without noticing. It's all over Amtara, it's all over Palace of the Dead, and certain areas in the overworld as well. It looks just like the Gridanian flag. It's got these two serpents that Gridania also has and maintained because it represents peace between the Hero and the Elezen. Meanwhile, instead of the lily at its core, which the Gridanian flag has, the Gelmorran flag has what I take to be a bouquet of mushrooms, which you would have to assume symbolizes the underground nature of their home.
Yeah, I mean, they have obviously they're going to have a much stronger relationship with things like mushrooms compared to Gridania, which gets to live above ground. So that seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, and the lily that is in the Gridanian flag is specifically to symbolize the accord made by Jorin, who we'll talk about in a second, with the elementals that allowed them to found Gridania and leave Gelmorra.
And as our final thing before we move into the sort of founding of Gridania, why don't we talk about Gelmorra and its relationship with conjuring magic? Because that is also something that links them.
Right. So this is a crucial part of Gelmorran history. The Gelmorrans never really, the majority of them seem to enjoy living in Gelmorra. They don't like it down there. They want to move onto the surface, so they spend a great deal of time trying to discover and master conjury. Now, they probably for a long time had what we would consider conjury as a combat class, but what they're looking for is the ability to commune with the elementals using conjury. They achieved this in 1076 when a conjurer, uh, like a newly minted conjurer by the name of Jorin Lightheart, successfully communes with the elementals and negotiates a return to the surface for his people. For his achievement, the elementals bless Jorin. They suffuse him with a bright light, and less than a decade later, he has a son. The son is born with two bumps on his head. These bumps later become horns, and by the age of 3, this son, the first Pajal, is a prophet. He's already predicting catastrophes and helping Gridania to avoid or to prepare for them. By the age of 12, he stops aging physically and declares himself. You might have thought that the general citizenry thought this was quite presumptive, but declares himself unilaterally the chosen mediator between the elementals and the people of the Shroud. He adopts a new name. We don't know what his original name was, but his name going forward is Ihohok Pota, in reference to the sound of the etheric communications of the elementals, and his family takes the surname Pota in response to this.
One of the things worthy of noting also is about 50 years before this period, you have the Ixali kicked out of the Shroud and them moving off to Zelphatal. And so, there's an opening, as it were, in the Shroud for a new group.
Right, that's right. The Gelmorras were down there watching very carefully to make sure that they could get the next housing in their lot that they wanted that opened up, and they managed eventually.
Well, and I'm sure that had nothing to do with why the elementals might have accepted them.
Yes, it almost certainly had very much to do with them. Of course, the elementals are very much about not having the resources of the 12s would overexploited. They're very very fastidious regarding this. So without the Ixal being kicked out, as horrible as it was for the Ixal, and as kind of unfair as it was, it needed to happen for Gridania to exist. Now that you can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and that's one of the good things about this game.
So now Gridania is founded, but it is lacking one of the groups that was part of Gelmorra, right? You have the Duskrite don't actually end up really joining up and being a part of Gridania as a whole.
That's right. So a section of the Elezen that live in Gelmorra choose not to go up onto the surface, and I can see why. The Dusk Whites have a proud culture. They have their own form of alchemy with the Pomanders. They have their own sort of runic warding magics. Life in the caves must have been very, very hard for them after Gelmorra dissolved, but they stuck to their ways. And I can't blame them for not trusting the elementals, who are, and must especially have been back then, just abjectly terrifying.
Truly. And they also have a repeated independent streak, it seems like, as a culture. And whatever you want to say about good or bad, you are inherently subservient to the elementals if you choose to be a civilization that exists within the Shroud. Like you can't escape that. If you want to live in harmony with them, you must be a form of subservient with them. Some might say, co-equals or in, symbiosis, but to quite a large extent, it is subservience.
Yeah, how co-equal can you really be when the elementals are constantly saying, if you don't do this, and this, and never deviate from it, we'll kill you. We will
Yeah, yeah.
unilaterally murder you.
Worthy of note, if nothing else.
Yeah, but they're just quite like I said, they have this really rich culture from what we can see. They have their own magics. They are very openly not fond of the elementals. They they still live in Gelmorra, in parts of Gelmorra. Obviously, most of Gelmorra is abandoned, but they still live in certain parts. Most notably, the Muntai cellars, like we mentioned, and some caves as well.
Yeah, one of the things that's a little bit sad, but I actually do think teaches you a lot about one of the things that's good about this game is framing, right? If you start in Gridania, and even if you just do quests in even just do quests in Gridania, a lot of times the Duskwhite get framed almost as consistently bad guys because you only see them under the context of being independent or living as poachers or being mistrustful of Gridania. And you don't always have the context as to why they might be that way in the first place, which is more often than not relatively fair.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that Ethis Asher, for example, every time that he comes across a Duskwhite NPC that is a villain, he's like, "Ah, another one."
Yeah, like the Astrologian quest, even the non 12's Wood Duskwhite are still somehow the bad guy.
Yes, and of course, the Duskwights are repeatedly villains in a great deal of the class quests in Gridania. Those that aren't are immigrant species, like the Keeper of the Moon, Makote, who is in the the Archer quests?
Yes.
And like we said, this is a big part of the oppressive and the insular nature of Gridania's government, which is lessening over time, but still there.
Well, we've now kind of come to, at the early years of Gridania, its founding, we've come to the inception of Gridania, and now we're about to continue on to what is modern Gridania. But that is going to be a separate episode because we have already run probably well over an hour, and that is probably going to be an hour in and of itself. And much like we did Thanalan, where we covered its early history and then its modern history, we will do so here as well.
We certainly will. We won't be doing that with Limsa because there is only one nation on Vilbrand, post Nim, post Fifth Ashlara. But for the Black Shroud and for Thanalan, it just made sense.
Yes, and it will be a deep and lovely conversation. I'm also looking forward to talking about our Sea Pirate boys when we get there.
Oh, very much so.
But in the meantime, let's spend a little more time in the 12's Wood.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Gridania is an awesome state with some really unusual cultural touchstones. A lot of people think of it as simply European Druidism, but there is a
No,
great
a lot
deal
of
of
Shinto.
Japanese. Yeah, a lot of Shintoism in there.
If anything, I actually think of it Shinto first with some Druidism as a part of it.
Yeah, I think it's just to a Western audience, its aesthetics remind them of the imagery of the Druids and stuff like that, or of pop culture Druids.
Well, with all of that said, I've been Elioaux and Niniri,
I've been Niniri Niri.
and we'll see you all next time, guys.
Yeah, enjoy the videos.
This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday. And comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.